thank you all again so much for joining us tonight. Tonight, we're joined by author Kenneth Rosen. He's here to talk about his book, Troubled, The Failed Promise of America's Behavioral Treatment Center. And I'm going to read you the Library Journal star review of the book. Library Journal, for you that don't know, is sort of the Bible here for our librarians when we're deciding which books to purchase. So Kenneth investigates the sordid world of unregulated treatment programs for teenagers. These infamous programs target teens suffering from depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, anger, truancy, impulse control, or drug and alcohol addiction. Their treatment options include wilderness courses, residential centers, juvenile delinquent halls, conversion therapy, and scared straight programs. Few of the programs, however, are accredited or licensed. They have qualified staff or offer educational credits of any kind. They are notorious for deceptive marketing, biased research, untrained staff, and religious indoctrination, situations that can result in PTSD and other ongoing trauma-related symptoms that sometimes last long into adulthood. And I'll skip ahead here, but it's a heartbreaking reality of a troubled industry, and it should be required reading for parents, educators, therapists, school consultants, and staff of adolescent mental health and drug treatment programs. And one more thing I want to do before we get to things is introduce Kenneth. So Kenneth is a contributing writer to Wired, a frequent contributor to the New York Times, and the Changing of a Continent columnist for Inkstick. He's the author of Troubled, which the New York Times called a searing expose and a public service. The book, I can't even read all these acclaims here you got here, all these awards and nominations and whatnot, but Troubled was a Times editor's choice, one of Newsweek's most highly anticipated titles of 2021, and was optioned separately as both a feature film and a docuseries. The book helped launch independent inquiries by the Government Accountability Office and the Health and Human Services Office of the Inspector General into abuses at congregate care facilities for at-risk youth. And his first book, Bulletproof Vest, was named one of the most fascinating books by Wired magazine from that year. He's a two-time finalist for the Livingston Award in International Reporting. He's won several awards as a war correspondent for his reporting in Iraq in 2018, and he was a finalist for awards for his reporting in Syria in 2019. I'll probably end it there, Kenneth. I can keep going. This is amazing. So Kenneth, thank you so much for joining us. And my first question, Kenneth, is why did you write this book?
I would just first say thank you, Robert, for having me on and inviting me out to speak with everyone tonight. I wrote Troubled because I was once a troubled teen myself. I might be considered a troubled adult today, but in my youth, I was also everything that you described. I was truant. I was difficult for my parents. I dabbled in drugs and alcohol. I had a lot of anger issues, and that led my parents to seek alternative treatments for me outside of what was available in our hometown in New Jersey. Trying all the things that were available to my parents, school counseling, family therapy, individual cognitive behavioral therapy, they were at their wits' end, and I was nearly expelled from high school. So in the middle of one night, they hired two individuals to come and take me from my bed and cart me off to the first of several programs. Over the course of 288 days, I would spend time at 3 different programs across the country, ranging from a wilderness therapy program in upstate New York to a residential treatment center, a therapeutic boarding school in Massachusetts, in Berkshire County, and then finally at a lockdown facility, residential treatment center for adolescents in southern Utah. And I never really considered it to be a big problem or a big ordeal, that which I went through, because I felt like I deserved it, in part because of my actions to my parents and my failure to go to school and sort of get my act together as a young man. But as I grew older, I started to stay in touch, or I got in touch with some of the people who I met at the programs and learned that a lot of people were still struggling despite the promise of these programs to impart some knowledge or some improvements upon the children. So when I started to speak with those young adults, I realized that I was entirely wrong, that it wasn't just an innocuous experience, that the programs didn't just come and go, but in fact stayed with a lot of us. So I went on a series of trips over the course of several months to meet with a lot of the former students at these programs, a lot of the former patients, and gather their stories to pull together what is, I believe, to be the first real assessment of what becomes of people who went to these programs many years later.
Now, you conducted over 100 interviews for your book. I'm curious, how did you land upon the four students or clients, kids, teens, that you ended up telling their stories? What made those stories worth telling?
So the book is bracketed by my own experience, as you read or listened to, and the four students had very similar traits and characteristics to a lot of the people that I met and also those that I interviewed. At some point during the interview process, as with most of my stories, I find similar narratives and themes being repeated, and I felt that these four individuals, two of whom are siblings, really expressed the full experience of someone who goes through these programs, the sort of trajectory from a difficult family life, a tough situation at home, to a wilderness program, and invariably the two worsening steps thereafter: the residential, the therapeutic boarding school, and then the treatment center before coming home, which is a trajectory that most students take still to this day through these programs.
Kenneth, I read a lot of books, and this book had a profound impact on me. I'm still thinking about it like 6 weeks later. I wish I had a better memory when it comes to this interview, but it did leave a lasting impact on me. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is the fact that the industry is so unregulated. Can you talk a bit about that and some of the unfortunate horrors that some of these programs unleashed on their students or their clients?
Aside from stringent HIPAA laws, a lot of the programs operate as private facilities, so they derive their revenue from unsuspecting parents who are told that this is the silver bullet that will treat their child's ailments, whether that be self-harm or sexual deviance or truancy or any number of problems facing our adolescents today. And so when they operate as a private entity, it's very difficult for state regulators to come in and just sort of poke around. One of the takeaways from the book, I hope, is that an increase in legislation and an increase in transparency around these programs will allow for more oversight and more bipartisan control over what these programs can offer children, and also who is allowed to operate the programs. One of the things that is not taken care of by the states are the vetting of the staff and faculty at many of the wilderness or residential programs. Many of them are fresh out of college or have only a high school diploma before they're entrusted with the care of many of these troubled kids. And I use troubled loosely here, of course, is the title of the book, but a lot of the children face many issues that I feel a lot of people face in their teenage years. And for them, they've just been either blessed or damned to a situation that is not fully vetted by either the state or their parents.
And I guess before we get too much further, can we define some of the different behavioral programs? For example, and you highlight 3 or 4 of them in the book, but the wilderness program versus the I guess detention hall facility, all the different types of facilities and programs there are. Broadly.
Sure. So aside from the inpatient and outpatient programs that probably many of the viewers tonight are aware of, there are 3 very distinct types of programs within what has become known as the troubled teen industry. When children are faced with no other option, parents often are told that the best way forward is to a wilderness therapy program. These exist all around the country, in upstate New York, in the Carolinas, in Utah. There are some 100+ programs out in Utah alone. It's a very popular state for that. Idaho, Wyoming, places of vast wilderness. And the children are sent there so that they can separate themselves from whatever bad elements they were surrounding themselves with at home, and sort of hopefully regenerate that persona, that individuality that they had before they went off off base. But unfortunately, it's often prefaced by a group or two or a single transporter, what they call a transporter, people who come in the middle of the night to then take you. Only because parents are told that the children will likely run away or cause further self-harm to themselves if they're not taken in this manner. Of course, there's been research to prove that these types of transporting lead to further PTSD and further issues later down the line. But with that said, the children are brought to these programs and then taught different types of modalities in, as far as treatment goes. They're taught about CBT, they're taught about sort of reconnecting with the earth and themselves, focusing on the present here and now, a lot of these tropes from just sort of couch-based therapy. From there, they're told that if you complete this program, you'll be able to go home, that you'll be able to go back to your normal life, and it's only about 28 days to 60 days, and everything will be fine. But parents are then on the back end being told that, look, to further the treatment, they'll need to continue their journey down this road, and that is usually followed up by a therapeutic boarding school. Therapeutic boarding schools can look very much like any boarding school, except there's a therapeutic component, right? So just like in Wilderness, you're visited by a therapist maybe once or twice a week. Other than that, you're doing group therapy sessions and living far from home. Oftentimes, and this is the case with several characters in the book, they don't fit in the boarding school. They are disruptive and aren't showing any true change, as they'd say, and are sent back to Wilderness only to find themselves at a worse facility afterwards, what they refer to as lockdown facilities or residential treatment centers. Those have much more stringent rules. Sometimes they're governed by the ability of staff to subdue the children with restraints or medicate them to the point of compliance. And those are also in varied places around the country. Some are in Utah, some are in Wyoming. There was one I was working on about in Wyoming, Nebraska. And that's generally seen as sort of the last step in this process, in large part because by then the teens have aged out of it. By 18, they can sign themselves out and either come home or go off on their own. So it's sort of a last-ditch effort to get children the help they need, but it's also an industry which feeds into itself. And I've always argued that if Wilderness was so effective and so necessary, why then would you need further treatment?
That's a great point. And you also in the book expose the accreditation agency that oversees some of these institutions. I think you said that there was roughly 190 institutions that were accredited, but when you actually contacted the accreditation agency, it almost seemed phony, that there was no teeth, and essentially it sounded like all they did was hold a conference once a year. Can you talk about the accreditation of these these organizations, or maybe lack thereof?
Yeah, there's several organizations that claim to accredit the programs. Two of them are the National Association for Therapeutic Programs in Schools, NATSAP, and the Outdoor Behavioral Council, which oversees the wilderness component. They don't really do their own vetting. They don't visit the programs as they should. They don't really keep in touch with the program directors and know exactly how they're fulfilling the needs of the children. They merely, as you noted, hold conferences and join together in a sort of marriage of convenience, insofar as one promoting the other and also working on developing academic papers that suggest these programs are effective. When I did speak with the head of NATSAP, the director of NATSAP, she had said that they were mostly known for their conferences, despite many programs having badges on their website saying that they are accredited by NATSAP. And we did a really interesting interview on NPR's A1A, in which she and I and Paris Hilton sort of dueled out the different facets of this organization and whether or not it's doing its job.
And another thing was the high school credits, educational credits. I guess some of these institutions were giving out fake diplomas, trying to pass them off as high school diplomas. Can you touch briefly on that as well?
Right. A lot of parents choose the therapeutic boarding school route because they're told that their grades will matriculate into either a high school diploma or back to their high school where they're from. In one instance, the Elan School in upstate New York had proffered fake diplomas for many years and was shut down by the state attorney general. And this isn't common, but it's not the same type or level of education that you'd receive from a state school, a state high school, a public high school, or even a private high school. I remember doing work at one of the programs, and it was just a matter of filling in a bunch of bubbles. Someone checked it off, and I would pass my sophomore year, and then I'd get a binder for my junior year. So it was less rigorous than parents believed it to be. I still believe it to be. This goes back to the accreditation process and the need for oversight, because a lot of these programs are given carte blanche to do whatever they want without really being under a microscope. How to improve that, I'm not quite clear on. I think we wanted to touch on this in the green room. There are two different sort of roads to take, right? To improve the industry, improve upon the industry, because certainly there is a need for it. There are children who definitely need help and could use access to better mental health care as with adults in this country, or shut down the industry entirely and put the care of children back into states' hands. As far as improving the industry goes, I think there are several bills, one of which is helmed by Senator Adam Schiff, which might offer some federal flooring, a federal level of oversight into the programs that could then engender upon the states, separate states, their own methodology to incorporate investigative bodies or oversight bureaus. But a lot of the children who went to these programs, the clients have opted to call for the end of these programs. Paris Hilton came out with a document about 2 years ago in which she described her experience at some of these programs, as well as Drew Barrymore and some other high-profile individuals. And shutting down the industry, in my mind, is very difficult. Again, because children do need this help. It's just not being offered in the way that is scientifically proven to help, which is community-based, goal-oriented therapy, which these programs don't offer.
Well, and I was going to get to that, but so in addition to them being unregulated, I think that in many cases you show that the results are at the very least unproven. I guess could you touch on that? It must have been very difficult for you to sort of track down so many of these clients and sort of follow up with them and get their experiences. I know that you mentioned that there were Facebook groups that some of the schools, graduates have. But that must have been tricky. So, how are you able to show, whether or not, the treatment that these teens received worked or didn't work? That must have been awfully difficult for you.
In one instance, we could talk about the transportation process, right? There's been recent research conducted out of Australia and I think Canada that suggests that being taken in the middle of the night is more traumatizing than the programs are able to treat. And so just by showing the juxtaposition of the handling of a child in such a drastic way and putting them into a program where the staff are insufficiently trained to care for such a patient, there's no way in my mind that you can prove this to be a successful modality when you are treating children for drug abuse, for instance, at a program after they were kidnapped in the middle of the night, and ignoring that entire process, that entire experience of that individual. They become the identified patient when in fact it was either the parents or this one event that was led to by the parents. In another situation, you can say that the congregate care model, in which you bring several patients who are suffering from video game addiction, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, they've had trauma from early childhood sexual abuse, from neglect, from foster care systems, are then told to sit in a room and work on their problems together, is, again, scientifically proven not to work. You can't treat everyone with a broad paintbrush. You have to really home in on what they need, and they're not doing that. To further that point, when you have a therapy session at these programs, it's once a week. everyone else that you're interacting with is ill qualified to handle the sort of problems that these children have. You can do a quick Google search to look for the job postings for some of these programs. If you were to reverse engineer a Google search today, you can find that the qualifications for these programs are very little. And so while they do offer therapy by licensed therapists, that happens very regularly. And when they're not offered therapy, those patients are then subjected to 9, 10, 12, 8, 7, 17 hours a day with people who are not licensed therapists. And therein lies an even greater problem. So again, community-based therapy has seemed to be and proves to be a more effective treatment, especially when you're taking them out of the family unit, which is supposed to be that binding agent that holds a youth together.
And so I think one of the reasons I asked that last question was that in the book you talk about how some of the former students successfully sue some of the schools. Some of the schools go bankrupt, although they claim it's not because of the lawsuits, but it's because of something else or whatnot, low enrollment or something. But then you also make the point to say that it's difficult for some of these students to be successful in their lawsuits because it's difficult to show, quantify the damages that resulted from their quote unquote education there. So could you talk a bit about that, about the lawsuit angle and how it's difficult for some of these students?
It's really hard to qualify or quantify emotional abuse, right? It's very much hearsay on either side. And parents are conditioned by the programs to know that, or to believe that anything that the children say to them, whether it be in letters or in phone calls, is manipulation tactics, whether it be, I'm being abused or they're hurting me or I'm not being fed enough. All of the parents are told to believe that this is just a technique used by every kid to try and get out of these programs. So from the very outset, the children are sort of damned to not be believed. But then later, when they do find support in order to launch a lawsuit, when they are successful, it's just a settlement. We don't have any documents from those hearings. We don't have any documents of the settlements. We don't know what went on. So the insights that could be brought from successful lawsuits, that which could bring forth further investigations and broader books than my own, are very limited. But there are several lawsuits going on now that are taking different tactics and different approaches, looking at the human trafficking angle, saying that if a child is being trafficked out of state, it's breaking several laws, and I feel like those might be more successful. But these types of lawsuits have been going on for decades. Back in the early 90s, magazines were writing stories about children who were dying in wilderness programs or who were being malnourished in wilderness programs. So I've always taken a very jaded stance on this and sort of known that it's a very long road to improving the programs, and that further lawsuits will only help to keep the story alive. If they're brought and continue to be brought.
So I guess let's talk about the 4 protagonists in your book. Well, let me back up and say, I love the way you designed your book. You throw a lot of facts and figures and research and studies. And you talk about, you briefly sort of talk about your own experiences. And let me just say that I'm glad you're with us today, and I'm glad you were able to write these books and you're doing what you're doing now. But then you also sort of turned it into, 3 stories, and we follow these characters throughout the book. And I loved at the end where you actually tell us what happened to them after they graduated. That was very powerful. But why don't we why don't we start backwards? We'll start with the 2 brothers. Can you tell us a little bit about them and why you included them in the story?
So Mike and Mark, they're part of the residential section of the book. This book is broken down into 3 sections: wilderness, residential, and lockdown. Sorry, they're part of the lockdown section. And they went through the very similar process of wilderness, residential, and then a lockdown facility, but we meet them once they're in a lockdown facility. Their story was really unique in that both the brothers were sent away to similar programs, and then at one point the same program, for very similar reasons. What became of them later is very representative of what becomes of those who went to the programs for drug addiction. This sort of disassociation from family, a difficulty finding any real sustained work, difficult financial issues. Also with relationships, they have a hard time trusting people, and one of the brothers ends up, I don't think I'm spoiling anything, one's up joining a gang and running with them for a while, only to now try and turn his life around. But the thing I won't spoil is when I go and meet him, sort of how he's acting and what he says versus what he's actually doing. A lot of that, in fact, was what was most surprising to me, is how many of the people I interviewed, the former clients, weren't aware of the issues they still struggled with, nor were they really aware that likely those struggles began at these programs. And that carries through the narratives of these other, the two other people who are in the book, Avery and Hazel.
Yeah, and I did get the point of the book, but one thing that stood out to me was when they were both in the same facility, one of the rules were that they couldn't acknowledge one another. I can't imagine being, side by side with my brother, but I'm not supposed to talk to him or even look at him. That just blew my mind. So many things. Folks, when you read this book, your jaw is going to be open. Every other page, there's some sort of revelation that's going to you're going to be shaking your head quite a bit. So then let's move. In the interest of time, we'll just kind of hit these characters one by one. So let's move on to sort of the start of the book and the wilderness program, the girl that went through and had that experience. Could you talk briefly about her story?
Sure. Avery was raised in New Jersey and was raised by her grandmother, and was the child of a heroin addict and a drug dealer. So she had already sort of had a really rough upbringing and saw a lot of difficult things to the effect of being with her mother as a baby when her mother was passed out behind the wheel of a car. And I mention that because it's one of the storylines that seems to go unappreciated in the treatment of the children, that the trauma must have been just them being haywired later in high school or being deviant for just deviance sake. But there's a lot of underlying trauma that was never addressed. So she ended up going to wilderness program and then a residential treatment therapeutic boarding school, and then a further facility after that. The interesting thing about her story is that she ends up coming back to the program many years later, the wilderness program, in order to teach at that program, in order to be an instructor at that program, only to give us readers and myself as the journalist a really keen insight into how these instructors are taught, sort of their thinking about the children and why some of the problems arise when they're entrusted with caring for the children in those wilderness programs. But it takes you all the way through upstate New York and through a cold winter and sort of all the weird, like you noted, not being able to talk to your brother, but all these weird things that break a person down at these programs, but are never made to build them back up again.
Yeah, that wilderness program in particular, I don't understand that. I don't understand the thought process behind much of that at all. And as you said, really, and again, I'm not qualified to say one way or the other, but in my opinion, really not addressing the underlying issues. Building a trap and making, I don't know how those two things go together, but anyway. And I
understand. I mean, I've tried to be sympathetic too in promoting the book and saying, I understand that individualism and, a sense of self-confidence and self-worth, it's very important, right? To learn how to go trap your own food and to build a fire. Great. But when you were just kidnapped 2 nights before and you're like, go build a stick castle because it'll make you feel better, it's very backwards. And I'm very appreciative to a lot of young researchers, a lot of young PhDs who are now turning their focus onto these programs to really home in on that sort of disparity.
And they have to do that exercise where they have to unpack their bag and pack their bag and unpack their bag and pack their bag. And I didn't quite understand any of that either. But I think and again, I don't know where the spoiler line is with this nonfiction book, but, as she is literally reunited with her family and driving away from the campsite, it seems like within minutes She's thinking about getting high, and she wants to talk to her boyfriend, who is, no good and up to trouble. So, how successful was that experience for her? It makes you wonder. Or anyway, and then moving on to the middle story there. Can you talk a little bit about the young teen who was living with the godmother, I think it was, and I think she might have been in Florida, somewhere down south. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, Hazel's from Louisiana, born and raised, and she had a similar background to Avery. And again, these were representative of a lot of the children that I interviewed. But she went into a wealthy family. The godmother was very wealthy, had a lot of means. Unfortunately, though, that those means were misdirected, and she landed up at a program too for sexual deviance. She didn't have the same support at home. The godmother wasn't really offering anything other than sort of stern corrective measures that weren't being tailored to this specific woman's needs, as far as types of treatment that were offered in rural Louisiana. And Hazel ends up witnessing some awful things at the program, things that only solidify her belief that she's worthless and that she doesn't deserve anything more than she already got. But a really interesting thing, again, for me, was just witnessing how they internalized a lot of what happened to them and made it a part of their persona, to the effect of not knowing that it was detrimental or that it was harming them still to this day. So when I went to go visit her in a ramshackle home in outside of New Orleans, she was convinced that she was on a better path, despite the fact that the door jamb was broken because her boyfriend had kicked it in a few nights prior. So there's a real dissonance that I think was instilled by the programs, and her story just serves the book more broadly to suggest that even after the wilderness program, she's not better off, but that she still requires further treatment that is then never given to her, based on what she experienced at those programs.
And of all the characters in the book, there are quite a few villains. And I thought that godmother, well-intentioned, certainly at the beginning, was perhaps the biggest villain of them all. Did not provide adequate support when she got back home out of that program. That scene that you painted in the group therapy session was, and then what happened next, that was something else. I think it's worth noting that a lot of these, the four that you highlight, their parent, the father was in jail, or the mother was a drug addict, the father was a drug dealer, or at least one of the teen girls was sexually abused, even younger as a child. So they all, I think were sort of troubled before their high school years. It was so like you were saying, and I guess And I don't know if you were, I guess you really, I don't know if you were able to interview the parents or godparents or grandparents or whatnot.
I talked to a lot of the parents, and I also was able to receive some of the most of the letters that they exchanged between each other while these students were at the programs. Yeah. And I've always also been very cautious, even in the writing of the book, to say, to no fault of the parents or the godparents or the guardian to have chosen this path, right? They were sold a raw deal and told a lie about what was best for their children. But I also know that a lot of the parents that I talk to today, I get a lot of emails and phone calls from parents who are either seeking this type of treatment and want my take on it, or have already sent their children away and want to talk about it. That sometimes the fabric of the family, like I noted earlier, the fabric of the family comes unstitched, and it oftentimes becomes the child who is the identified patient rather than their situation. I often have phone calls with parents who say, my child has opportunities for the best of everything, and I don't know what to do. We've always been supportive of them. And eventually at the end of the conversation, 45 minutes later, I'm told about a very nasty divorce that they're still going through right now, and that this is somehow not playing a role in the difficulty the child is having. So I've always encouraged everyone to take a really deep, honest look at what is happening at home. And if it gets to a point where it's this bad, then maybe there wasn't enough presence in the house to begin with, and that really needs to be reworked before a child either comes home, if they're away now, or before they're sent away, to give that sort of family a second chance.
By the way, in the first like few pages of the book, you mention how a person's brain isn't like fully. I'm going to get this wrong, I think, but you'll correct me. The person's brain isn't like fully formed until they're like 25 or something, and I think we can kind of expect teenagers to make bad and rash decisions. But I guess, can you talk to that point and, sort of, at what, at what point should, I guess what's normal and what's not normal? I think that's something that came up where like several of the folks that you spotlighted, the kids were saying that, what they were doing is just normal teenage behavior and their friends do the same thing, and why are they being punished? Why are they being sent away? Whereas their friends and teens are just, their friends are just going on and living their lives. So can you touch on that? Hopefully, you know what I'm trying to say, but.
Yeah, that's actually a Supreme Court ruling with respect to sentencing juveniles to the death penalty. Insofar as the brain developing around 24 and 29, fully developing, that everything stops changing. And that, for me, that was my aha moment when I turned that age and somehow everything started to make sense and longevity and purpose and all these things came into play for me. It's oftentimes seen as what children do. People try drugs, they try alcohol, but some people do take it too far. And I think those children did need the help. Like I said, some do need help, some don't. But the underlying issues that lead those children to even further those activities is something that goes unaddressed. Right. I know for me, my wife has said that, I was doing all the things you were doing, but nobody ever thought to send me away and it all worked out in the end. Which is, difficult for a lot of parents who are watching their children go through suicide attempts or, the worst of the worst to say, oh, well, they'll get out of it. They'll grow out of it because maybe they won't. Maybe rock bottom is death. Maybe it's not just an aha moment. So it's just a very difficult time for parents to really figure out what to do. And I find that in the reporting of the book that at that moment, that's when a lot of predatory education consultants, people who suggest these programs or therapists then come in and offer a guiding hand, but oftentimes not to the benefit of the kid or the family.
All right, so I have a few more questions, but I think the audience will probably do a better job than I'm doing. So let me start turning over to the audience. We have, it looks like at least 5 questions here. So folks, at this point, if you have any questions for Kenneth, feel free to get them into the Q&A or into the chat, and I will do my best to address them. So Teresa asks, during the research for your book, what did you learn that surprised or shocked you the most?
Oh, thanks for the question. What shocked me the most was just how many people really weren't aware of them still being attached to this negative insight that was given to them at such a young age, that they went on feeling worthless because the programs told them that they were no better than a troubled teen. And I say that mostly from a personal standpoint, because that helped me really understand who I was when I was writing the book. And I also, what was most surprising also was just this catharsis that so many parents were seeking from speaking with me, and the same for the former clients, that nobody had really considered on a deeper level the fundamental nature of these programs and what they experienced. And parents and psychologists and therapists and program directors and the clients themselves were so willing to talk because they had been ignored for so long. And I think that was just surprising, in that they still had this burden that they were carrying, that oftentimes the biggest damnation someone can have is living in the past, right, and not looking to the future. So that was what was most surprising to me. And I still find that today when parents call me up and clients call me up and want to discuss this, because they just haven't had that sort of venting yet, that release yet.
Speaking of parents, Kenneth, have your parents read your book? And if so, what did they think about it? And how is your relationship with your parents or family now?
I appreciate that question. I get it a lot. My father read it. My mother says she won't read it because she doesn't want to think about it anymore. So I don't know if she's picked it up. I've definitely signed her copy. My parents and I have a really great relationship. Currently, I'm on vacation. My father's upstairs playing with my children. My mother just visited with them last week. So we have a really good family relationship. It took a long time to get there, but it came about naturally. It came about through me growing up. They say that at first your parents are the smartest people you know, then they're the dumbest, and then again they're the smartest later in life. And that simple pattern seemed to prove true to me and my family, at least the way that I interact with them. But we didn't do anything special to improve that. We just sort of went about our lives and connected when we could. As far as what they think about the book, my father was the one who told me to be a writer to begin with. He was the one who suggested I study it in college. He suggested I try journalism. I owe him everything, to the plane ticket that got me my first job at the New York Times, to just being able to bring my family together like we are today. And the same goes for my mom. She's been extraordinarily supportive of everything that I've pursued. And, my father and mother often joke, like, no matter what you say that happened to you at the programs, at least you got a book out of it. So there's that take on it too.
There you go. That's a silver lining, I guess. Anne asks, to what do you attribute your own successful transition to more adaptive behavior and self-fulfillment and success?
What you're talking about is being more or less well-adjusted. And I think that took a lot of time. It also took finding a passion, being able to say, I don't want to be hungover when I have to go to the staff writer meeting tomorrow, made all the difference to me, right? Having a purpose and having a goal in mind, and really starting to risk something more unattainable, which was my own reputation, my own value to society and to my friends and family. And as I grew, that became more and more of a foundation of who I wanted to become, that sort of contributor to society, and being not someone on the fringe and seen as a problem, but someone who can help other people and who can also just do good work. At the end of the day, feel good about that. I also accredit it to my wife, who I met while in grad school at Columbia University. Having that sort of further support network, that person that was there to listen to me and talk me through some of my own troubles, but also to give me insights into myself, into ways that I was behaving and things that I had said that I might not have considered otherwise. So there's just this really fascinating and really fulfilling support network that I've happened upon, I suppose, over the last several years, that really helped me become the person I am today. But again, as I said in the beginning, I'm still working on a lot of things. I'm not in formal therapy, but I know that if I take it one day at a time, it'll still progress in a positive direction.
An anonymous attendee asks a related question, which I'm not going to sort of repetitive, but I will ask this part. Have you pursued your own training in the area of psychology or sociology?
My training is solely as a journalist and as a writer. I make no attempt to offer medical advice or insight into what's best for children or adults. In fact, I go, I think, out of my way to not tell any parent what to do with their children, which might be a fault of the book, but that's not my realm. My job was to report what was happening at the facilities, both then and now, and to highlight some of the issues that could be improved upon were a state agency or a federal body to look into it. And I'm hopeful that those changes will come soon.
A couple of questions regarding parents. And by the way, I referenced villains in the book. I don't want you to think that I think all the parents and the guardians are villains, although I don't like that godmother. But other than that, I don't fault the parents at all. I wanted to put that out there. So Michelle says, I really appreciate you taking the time to address the parents in this situation. A lot of parents may have felt shame and regret for sending their children there. Society plays a role in relating information. How could have parents done things differently with the options they had?
Well, of course, it depends on what options they had. Some communities don't have the community-oriented, goal-focused treatment options that other communities do have. Sometimes the only option is to send the child away because that's what parents are told to do. There are, though, however, a lot of outpatient programs that offer the same type of treatment, where you stay within the community and then work with a family counselor to hold that unit together. It seemed to me that the overwhelming sense of an impending doom for that child really drove a lot of the decision making within a family that's facing a crisis. Um, but oftentimes, if again the parent can separate what they're going through with what the child goes through is going through, it seems like some of the choices might be more obvious. And I say that because I'm thinking about the parent who was going through the really nasty divorce and saying that you were spending a lot of time in court, but maybe you just needed to spend more time at home. And of course, that might be a reductive way of looking at it and saying, well, you just need to spend more time with your kids. But isn't the option, the alternative to send your kid to wilderness the same as taking your kid camping for 5 days and re-establishing that sense of connectivity to nature and family? Some of these things almost seem self-evident when you talk about it in sort of generalizations, in things that you know to be beneficial, but for some sort of structured desire, whether it be the kid needs to go to high school and needs to get a high school diploma, but there being GEDs and outdoor education programs that aren't therapeutic, but that also offer high school credits and college credits. There's just a lot of options today, and I've found that it's very hard, even for me, to really understand what my children are going through, even though I feel like I can relate to having been there at that time. The world is just changing too fast. And it's hard to say that, well, if they just stick through it, or they just finish high school, or they just go to therapy, everything will be all right. Same with deciding on a program. Oh, if we just go to a program, it'll be fixed. It's just not, stagnant as far as what treatment options are. It's more kinetic, and things need to change and be developed as the child needs it.
Now, obviously, your book focuses on sort of the negative aspect of things, and rightfully so. We do have a question, though. Did you ever see any successes? My son had to go to one of these facilities to protect him legally, as he was a danger to his brothers. So did you come across any success stories, Kenneth?
There are often success stories sent to my inbox. And they generally come from parents whose children are in the programs or recently graduated from the programs. And I've always wondered why the children weren't messaging me. It's a success story until it's not. If a longevity study focuses on 6 months post-program, oftentimes what you'll find is that the child is much better off because they're scared of being sent away. That's why it was important to impress upon the readers of this book that this was the first time that a 10-year look at how people ended up was being done. They don't do longevity studies maybe beyond 2 years. And those studies are always glowing. I just know that I know that it's tough, and I know that sometimes it's out of the parents' hands. But again, if it's better for the family, then it's better for the family. It's a tough nut to crack. Are there success stories? How are we defining success? Are we defining success as the child no longer does drugs but is not gainfully employed? Are we defining success as a high school diploma but no desire to go to college? Are we defining success as never going back to a program again, but wanting to stay at home because they can't connect with people because they fear they'll be ratted out or can't trust anyone? I don't know what success looks like. Am I successful? By some measures, yeah. Am I unsuccessful in a lot of other measures? Sure. So it's just tough to say what a success story was. But every time anyone ever told me that they were like 100% better after the programs, it just seemed to me that there wasn't enough time between when they went to the programs and now, or they were hiding something that they weren't really aware of yet and still needed further insight into who they were and why they were feeling that way before they came to some gleaning notion that, maybe I'm not better off. Maybe I am messed up in a couple ways. And sometimes that comes to fore when they're older and they're trying to have romantic relationships. They're, having a difficult time, and the partner always seems to have a problem. And why do they always have a problem? And I can't find anyone right. And the answer is always someone else and never themselves, right? And this is a sort of insight that takes years and years of therapy or years of just working on it internally to figure out. So I know that's not a great answer, but it's what I got. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Related question. Aside from the well, if nothing else, your book was a success, by the way, and it's going to lead to change, hopefully. But an anonymous attendee asks, "Do you feel you got any benefits from the programs that were forced on you?"
It's a good question. I think maybe my insight into my own individuality and my own sort of place in society and in a hierarchy was fermented a little bit more. I mean, I knew that I was a leader, or I had leadership qualities, but I wasn't necessarily a leader in the sense of, you know, like group mentality or group think. I was better as an individual leader, like so some consider an entrepreneur. That type of approach to life benefited me when I understood that I was not someone who was going to go work 9 to 5, and I needed to follow a script and then go to college and then do this and then do that. But I needed to make my own way. Understanding myself more is what I took away. Being able to reckon with who I was as a teenager versus who I knew I could be was beneficial. But honestly, I can't really think of any fundamental skills that I took with me. Maybe rock climbing from one of the easier programs, or starting a fire with a bow drill. As far as like hard skills go, that's about it. You know, and a lot of the relationships that I had from those programs that I carried on into adulthood were very toxic too. And I found that with a lot of the former clients who stayed in touch with people from these programs ended up just going back into a lot of what they were doing previously, in large part because they just stayed with people who they met at the programs. So those hard skills or soft skills that they might have gleaned were then quickly vaporized after they left the programs.
Got a couple questions on the wilderness programs, and then I think we're going to wind it down. Virginia asks, what skills and training did the employees at the wilderness programs have? Is there any professional mental health oversight?
So the programs that I looked into, a lot of the counselors or instructors had several, maybe 2 or 3 weeks of survival training, sort of orientation into how to handle children, who, you know, whether or not they're getting out of hand, who to call, where to take them in the woods, how to start a fire, when to start the fire, what to do if it rains, what to do if there's a thunderstorm coming, maybe basic first aid. But none of them really had any clinical experience other than the therapists who visited once a week. Which you would mostly see were people who really enjoyed the outdoors, people who would normally just want to be hiking or fishing or kayaking, real outdoorsy people. Now, that isn't to say that there are programs with young men and women who studied outdoor behavioral leadership at, I think there's a program in New Hampshire who have degrees in this type of program, not the type of therapy, but in types of outdoor guiding, right? Normally the types of training that would go to someone who's going to take a group out fishing for the weekend or camping for the weekend or hiking for the weekend, not for handling unruly children who need serious help.
Let's go with Mackenzie's question, because she asked it a couple times. What are your thoughts on students being referred to these types of programs through their public school systems, such as stipulations in their IEPs, their individualized education plans, where a student should receive education at a residential program or school?
This must be from, I think she must be from Illinois, because the only ever time I've heard IEP is from Illinois. If I'm wrong, correct me.
Well, actually, Kenneth, IEP is a thing in Massachusetts.
Okay, excellent. So the IEP being sent to the programs through the state school or a public high school is an issue, at least in Illinois. This is why I bring it up. Is an issue in Illinois because the state pays for the programs themselves, for the kid to go to these programs, because they're not receiving the help and care they need thank you, Michelle, at the program, at the public high school in the state in Illinois. And so that then the state is charged with paying for these programs that are ineffective or not evidence-based treatment programs. What do I think about the students? I don't know the students. So I don't know what to think of them on a personal basis. But what I do know is that there's a lack of education between maybe the school therapist or the or the head of the school and the parents and the education consultants and the programs to fully disseminate the options available to children. Oftentimes you'll lean toward where the parents can get funding for the programs because they are expensive. I note that in some instances they're as expensive as Ivy League educations. So oftentimes those choices are driven by both bad information and also what financial opportunities are available. And I could go into a whole spiel about how I think about the inadequacy of the American healthcare system and the mental health care opportunities available to children, but that's a different scope. So that's my answer. Sorry.
Yeah, and just to clarify, Patty in the chat says, I do not think any Massachusetts teacher or counselor could recommend this. And
you could recommend anything.
I think that is accurate.
But you could recommend anything to anyone. At the end of the day, it's a private facility, and oftentimes they're not in the state's care, that they're in the parents' care, who then sign away the guardianship to these programs. So if a parent decides, based on a recommendation from a parent who thought it was beneficial, sure. I mean, it's not written in stone. The teachers can suggest anything. But that's wherein lies the problem, is that they're not maybe educated on the opportunities that are in the state, that are available to families, that are nearby, that parents can come and visit at. Right.
Okay. Well, this is something I obviously am ignorant of. I don't have a child on an IEP. Okay, so we've hit 8 o'clock. So folks, why don't you in the chat let Kenneth know how much you enjoyed tonight's presentation. He really carried it with wonderful answers. I'll read a couple of comments.
If I could just interject real
Sure.
quick, Rob. For anyone that didn't want to post a question in the chat or felt a little bit nervous about posting in a public forum, please
Sure.
feel free to email me directly. I'm always open to having chats with parents or educators about the book or about anything that I might be able to help them with. You can go to my website, kennethrrosen.com. It's just a place where you could find my email and then reach out to me there. I'm happy to address anything that wasn't touched on tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Kenneth. That's important. I appreciate you taking the time to do that. Anonymous attendee says, thanks for sharing. I hope that your book will shine a spotlight for change in the programs. Mary says, fascinating session. Looking forward to reading the book. Teresa says, great interview. Glad you are shedding light on this. Joy, appreciate your time and thoughtfulness. Kathleen said this was a real eye-opener. Gerard says this was very informative. Claire felt it was a wonderful program. Virginia says very enlightening. Patty says great talk. I think you get the idea, Kenneth. So wonderful job, Kenneth. I have a feeling, folks, that this isn't the last we're going to hear of Kenneth. I think he's going to make real change, and it started with the book that he wrote here. So thank you for shining a spotlight on this very troubled industry. And folks, look for that email from me tomorrow with a link to a feedback survey, link to a recording, information about other upcoming virtual author visits. And one thing that's really neat is as part of Kenneth didn't want any money for this. What Kenneth wanted is for some of the libraries to purchase copies of his book and make them available to you. So we'll certainly be doing that, mostly in the form of book club kits. But every library who partnered with Tewksbury tonight will be adding at least 3 or 4 copies of the book to their shelves. So you can look for that in the next, hopefully 2 to 4 weeks. But anyway, Kenneth, any last words? You mentioned your website. Anything else you want to mention before we wrap up?
Nope, I really appreciate everyone who came out.
All right. Well, Kenneth, go back upstairs to your downstairs to your children, and hopefully your father's doing a good enough job there for you. But thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Thanks, Rob. Bye-bye.
Have a good one.